The gangplank groaned under the weight of passengers and cargo as Victoria Winston made her way onto the wooden dock of Dawson City, Yukon. The crisp October air of 1896 bit at her cheeks with an unexpected sharpness that made her pull her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. Victoria gripped the worn leather handle of her carpet bag. Around her, men shouted instructions in multiple languages, while dogs barked and horses snorted clouds of vapor into the cold air. The scent of sawdust, coal smoke, and something indefinably wild filled her nostrils. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribcage as she adjusted the pearl buttons on her navy wool traveling dress, the only decent garment she owned. She was determined to make a proper first impression on Arthur Mackenzie, the man who had answered her carefully worded advertisement in the matrimonial section of the newspaper. Following the directions that her soon-to-be husband Arthur had provided in his last letter, Victoria made her way through the bustling streets toward the Bonanza Hotel. Her button-up boots clicked against the wooden boardwalks that connected the various establishments, each footstep echoing her mounting anxiety. Shop signs painted in bold letters advertised everything from mining equipment to hot meals, while saloon doors swung open to release bursts of raucous laughter and piano music. The Bonanza Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its false front decorated with ornate wooden trim painted in cheerful yellow and green. Large windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, and a hand-painted sign proclaimed rooms available for reasonable rates. Victoria paused at the entrance, smoothing down her auburn hair beneath her modest felt hat before pushing through the heavy oak doors. The lobby welcomed her with warmth and unexpected elegance. Persian rugs covered polished wooden floors, while brass fixtures cast a golden glow over leather armchairs arranged around a massive stone fireplace. The walls displayed oil paintings of mountain landscapes and mining scenes, lending an air of permanence to what she had expected to be a rough frontier establishment. Behind the registration desk stood a woman of perhaps 40 years, her silver-streaked hair pinned in an elaborate Gibson girl style that seemed impossibly sophisticated for such a remote location. She wore a burgundy velvet dress with jet buttons and delicate lace at the throat, her manner suggesting both warmth and sharp intelligence. The woman looked up from her ledger book with bright green eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Her voice carried a slight Irish accent, softened by years in America. "Welcome to the Bonanza, dear. I'm Dorothy Jenkins, though everyone around here calls me Dottie. You must be Victoria Winston. Arthur Mackenzie told me to expect you on today's boat." Victoria felt a rush of relief at being recognized and expected. She set down her carpet bag and approached the desk with growing confidence. "Yes, that's right. Arthur said I should come here first to get my bearings before we meet. I confess I'm rather nervous about the whole arrangement." Dottie's expression shifted subtly, the warm smile fading as her eyes took on a serious cast. She glanced around the lobby, then stepped out from behind the desk and gently took Victoria's elbow. "Child, I think you'd better sit down. There's something I need to tell you, and it's not the kind of news anyone should hear standing up." Victoria's stomach dropped as Dottie guided her to one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. The older woman's face had grown pale, and she twisted her hands together in a gesture that spoke of barely contained distress. "What's happened? Is Arthur all right? Has something delayed our meeting?" Dottie knelt beside the chair, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper that somehow made the news more terrible. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so very sorry to have to tell you this. Arthur Mackenzie was killed in a mining accident just 4 days ago, a tunnel collapse at his claim up on Flat Creek. He died instantly, they said." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. The comfortable lobby seemed to tilt around her as the implications crashed over her in waves. Arthur was dead. Her future husband, her escape from poverty, her chance at a new life, all gone in an instant. She had traveled 3,000 miles to marry a man who was already in his grave. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her mouth, fighting back a sob that threatened to escape. The pearl buttons on her dress suddenly felt like weights, reminders of the care she had taken with her appearance for a man who would never see her. "I don't understand," she whispered through her fingers. "We were supposed to meet today. He sent me money for the passage. We had plans." Dottie's eyes filled with compassion as she reached out to cover Victoria's hands with her own. Her touch was warm and steady, an anchor in the suddenly shifting world. "I know, child. Arthur was a good man, one of the finest who ever came through that door. He spoke of you often these past weeks, showed everyone your photograph. He was so looking forward to your arrival." Victoria pulled her hands away and stared into the dancing flames of the fireplace. The cheerful crackle of burning logs seemed to mock her despair. She had burned her bridges in Chicago, sold her few possessions to help pay for the journey north. There was nothing to return to, no family to take her in, no prospects for employment that would keep her from the streets. "What am I going to do?" The question escaped as barely a whisper. "I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I used all my savings to come here." Before Dottie could respond, the hotel doors opened with a gust of cold air that set the fire flickering. Heavy footsteps crossed the lobby, accompanied by lighter, quicker steps that suggested a child's presence. Victoria looked up to see a tall man removing a brown felt hat from dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. He wore a heavy woolen coat over work clothes, his boots still bearing traces of mud from the goldfields. His face was weathered by outdoor work and grief, with deep lines around blue eyes that shared Arthur's gentle expression. Beside him stood a girl of perhaps 7 years, her blonde hair braided neatly down her back beneath a knitted cap. She wore a blue wool dress under a small coat, her wide eyes taking in the scene with curious intelligence. The man's gaze found Victoria immediately, recognition flickering across his features. He approached with careful steps, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Miss Winston? I'm James Mackenzie, Arthur's brother. This is my daughter Annabelle." Victoria rose unsteadily from her chair, her legs weak with shock and uncertainty. James Mackenzie stood taller than most men, his presence solid and sturdy. Despite the similarity in their features, there was a hardness to James that spoke of greater trials endured than the gentleness of Arthur's photograph. "Mr. Mackenzie," she managed, her voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Dottie just told me about Arthur. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you." James nodded gravely, his blue eyes reflecting pain that ran deeper than recent grief. When he spoke, his voice carried traces of sadness. "Thank you. Arthur was a good man and a fine brother. He spoke highly of you, said he was eager to start a new life with someone who understood the value of hard work and devotion." Annabelle stepped closer to her father, slipping her small hand into his larger one. She studied Victoria with the direct gaze of a child who had learned to assess adults carefully. "Papa, is this the lady Uncle Arthur was going to marry?" James squeezed his daughter's hand gently before answering. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Miss Victoria." Victoria knelt down to Annabelle's level, managing a small smile despite her emotional turmoil. The child's face was heart-shaped and serious, with her father's blue eyes and hair the color of wheat in summer sunlight. "Hello, Annabelle. Your uncle wrote about you in his letters. He said you were the smartest little girl in all of Dawson City." A shy smile crept across Annabelle's features as she stepped slightly behind her father's legs. James cleared his throat, his expression growing more determined. "Miss Winston, I realize this situation is difficult for everyone involved. I know my brother would want to ensure you are taken care of. I would like to help you, if you'll allow." Victoria stood slowly, uncertainty written across her features. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose on your family during such a difficult time. I'll find some way to manage on my own." Dottie stepped forward, her expression both practical and compassionate. "Child, there aren't many opportunities for single women in Dawson City, especially with winter coming on. The work that's available isn't the kind you'd want to consider." James nodded in agreement. "Arthur has a small cabin near his claim out on Flat Creek. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. Annabelle and I have been staying there since his death, trying to keep the claim active. You're welcome to join us. We could use help with domestic matters, and Annabelle could benefit from a woman's influence." Victoria looked between James and his daughter, seeing genuine kindness in both their faces, despite the awkwardness of the situation. The alternative, Facing a harsh northern winter alone with no resources seemed impossible to contemplate. "I don't know what to say. This isn't how I expected things to go," Victoria said. Annabelle tugged on her father's sleeve, then whispered something in his ear. James's expression softened as he listened to his daughter's words. James gave a wary smile. "Annabelle says she thinks Uncle Arthur would want us to take care of you. She's probably right about that." After a long moment of internal struggle, Victoria nodded slowly. "If you're certain it wouldn't be too much trouble, I would be grateful for your help, at least until I can figure out what comes next." James's smile transformed his weathered features, revealing the family resemblance to his late brother more clearly. "It's settled then. We'll collect your things and head out to the cabin before dark. The days are getting shorter, and the temperature drops quickly once the sun goes down." The journey to Arthur's cabin took them through increasingly wild terrain as they left Dawson City behind. James drove a sturdy wagon pulled by two sure-footed mules, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the cooling air. Victoria sat beside him on the wooden bench, her carpetbag secured in the wagon bed alongside supplies from town. Annabelle had curled up in the back, wrapped in wool blankets as she dozed against sacks of flour and beans. The landscape around them grew more dramatic with each mile. Towering spruce and fir trees lined the rough trail, their branches heavy with the promise of coming snow. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with white that gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight. The air carried scents of pine resin, wood smoke, and something clean and wild that Victoria had never experienced in the city. "It's beautiful out here," she said softly, not wanting to wake Annabelle. "I can see why Arthur chose this place." James guided the mules around a particularly rough section of trail before responding. "Arthur always said the beauty made up for the hardships. He loved being outdoors, away from crowds and noise, said it helped him think clearly." Victoria detected a note of sadness in his voice that went beyond grief for his brother. "You came from Seattle," Arthur mentioned in his letters. James's hands tightened on the reins as painful memories flickered across his features. "Yes, we needed a fresh start after my wife Sarah died. Too many reminders there, too many places that held her memory. I'm sorry. That must have been terrible for both of you," Victoria said, sadness in her tone. "Pneumonia took her last winter. She was gone in less than a week." His voice grew rough with remembered anguish. "Annabelle stopped speaking for months afterward. Arthur convinced me to bring her here, said the adventure and open spaces might help her heal." Victoria glanced back at the sleeping child, her heart aching for what the little girl had endured. "Has it helped?" "Some. She talks now, smiles occasionally, but she still has nightmares, still asks when Mama's coming home." They fell into comfortable silence as the wagon continued along the winding trail. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the forest and painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Victoria found herself studying James's profile as he concentrated on driving, noting the way grief had carved deep lines around his eyes while somehow leaving his essential kindness intact. Arthur's cabin appeared in a clearing beside Flat Creek, a modest structure built from peeled logs and chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting someone had been keeping the fire burning in their absence. A small barn stood nearby, along with various mining equipment and lumber stacked under canvas tarps. "It's not much," James said as he helped Victoria down from the wagon, "but it stays warm and the roof doesn't leak." The interior revealed a single room with a loft accessible by ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while windows on either side provided natural light and views of the creek and surrounding forest. Simple furniture crafted from local timber filled the space: a dining table with mismatched chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, and built-in bunks along the far wall. Victoria set down her carpetbag and looked around with growing appreciation. The cabin possessed a cozy charm that no amount of city elegance could match. Hand-sewn quilts covered the bunks, while shelves held books and personal belongings that spoke of the lives lived within these walls. "Arthur built most of this himself," James explained as he carried supplies inside. "He had a real talent for working with wood. Those shelves there, the dining table, all his handiwork." Annabelle had awakened during the unloading, made her way inside, and now stood beside the fireplace, her small hands stretched toward the warmth. She watched Victoria explore the space with curious eyes. "Miss Victoria, would you like to see Uncle Arthur's books? He had lots of stories," the child asked shyly. Victoria knelt beside Annabelle, touched by her shy offer of friendship. "I would love to see them." "Do you like stories, Annabelle?" The little girl nodded eagerly. "Papa reads to me sometimes, but he's not as good at the voices as Uncle Arthur was." James chuckled as he organized supplies on the kitchen shelves. Arthur always was better with theatrics. He used to put on quite a performance for bedtime stories. As evening settled over the cabin, they worked together to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Victoria found herself falling naturally into domestic routines, while James tended the fire and Annabelle set the table with careful precision. The domesticity felt strange after her long journey, yet somehow comforting in its ordinary rhythms. After supper, James read aloud from one of Arthur's adventure novels, while Victoria mended a tear in Annabelle's dress by firelight. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor between them, her attention divided between the story and watching Victoria's careful stitches repair the blue fabric. When it came time for bed, Victoria offered to sleep on the floor, but James insisted she take Arthur's bunk, while he and Annabelle shared the larger bed in the loft. She lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of wind in the trees and water flowing over rocks in the nearby creek. The days that followed established a routine that gradually felt less strange and more natural. James left each morning to work Arthur's claim, returning at sunset with reports on his progress and news from neighboring miners. Victoria tended the cabin, cooked meals from their stored provisions, and spent long hours with Annabelle, who proved to be an intelligent young girl and eager to learn. The little girl had been without formal schooling since leaving Seattle, so Victoria began teaching her reading, writing, and arithmetic using Arthur's books and paper salvaged from town. Annabelle absorbed lessons with the hunger of a child starved for intellectual stimulation, her quick mind grasping concepts with impressive speed. "Why do letters make different sounds in different words?" Annabelle asked one afternoon. Victoria considered the question carefully, remembering her own struggles with English spelling as a child. "Language is like a river that's been flowing for hundreds of years. It picks up new sounds and meanings from all the different people who use it, just like a river picks up stones and sand from the places it flows through." Annabelle's eyes lit up with understanding. "So, words change as they travel from place to place?" "Exactly. That's why some people speak with different accents, even though we all speak English. Their words traveled through other places before coming here." As October gave way to November, the first serious snowfall blanketed the cabin in pristine white that transformed the landscape into something magical. Victoria stood at the window each morning, marveling at how the snow softened the harsh edges of rocks and made the surrounding forest look like illustrations from fairy tale books. The weather change brought new challenges. James worked shorter days as temperatures dropped, and daylight hours diminished. Victoria learned to bank the fire carefully each night and wake before dawn to stoke it back to life before the cabin grew too cold. She mended everyone's clothing with extra care, knowing that warm, intact garments could mean the difference between comfort and misery during the long winter ahead. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, the three inhabitants of Arthur's cabin grew closer with each passing day. James began sharing stories of his childhood in Seattle during evening meals. Victoria reciprocated with tales of her life in Chicago, carefully edited to emphasize amusing incidents rather than dwelling on the poverty and loneliness that had driven her north. Annabelle blossomed under the attention of two caring adults, her natural curiosity asserting itself as she explored their snowy domain each day. She built elaborate snow fortresses, learned to identify animal tracks, and peppered both James and Victoria with endless questions about everything from cloud formation to the habits of Arctic foxes. One particularly cold evening in mid-November, as the wind howled around the cabin and snow piled against the windows, Annabelle looked up from her book with a thoughtful expression. "Papa, do you think Mama would like Miss Victoria?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. James set down the harness he had been mending, his expression growing distant as he considered his daughter's words. "I think your mama would appreciate how kind Miss Victoria has been to you, sweetheart. She always wanted you to have good influences in your life." Victoria felt her cheeks warm with something that had nothing to do with the fire. Over the past weeks, she had begun to care deeply for both James and Annabelle, though she tried to keep her growing affection carefully hidden. The situation remained temporary in her mind. She was a guest seeking refuge until she could establish her own independence. "Miss Victoria makes the best pancakes," Annabelle continued with the blunt honesty of childhood, "and she doesn't get scared when the wind sounds angry." James's eyes met Victoria's across the cabin, and she saw something in their blue depths that made her pulse quicken. There was gratitude there, and warmth, and perhaps something deeper that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. December arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left snowdrifts taller than Annabelle. The cabin became their entire world during the storm, its walls the only barrier between them and a hostile wilderness that seemed determined to test their resolve. On the second day of confinement, cabin fever led to an impromptu celebration when Victoria discovered ingredients for a cake among their supplies. She and Annabelle spent the afternoon mixing batter and decorating their creation with preserved berries, while James contributed by telling increasingly elaborate stories about famous cakes throughout history. "And so, the wedding cake was so tall that birds nested in the top layer," he concluded with theatrical seriousness, causing Annabelle to dissolve into giggles. "Papa, that's not a real story." "How do you know? Were you there?" James teased. Victoria laughed at their playful banter, realizing she felt happier than she had in years. The simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, of being needed and appreciated, filled spaces in her heart she hadn't realized were empty. That evening, as they shared their improvised cake by firelight, Annabelle made an announcement that surprised both adults. "I've been thinking, and I decided something important." James and Victoria exchanged amused glances at the little girl's serious tone. "What have you decided, sweetheart?" James asked. "I think Uncle Arthur sent Miss Victoria to take care of us, like guardian angels in the stories, only she's real." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at the child's innocent faith. "Oh, Annabelle, that's a lovely thought, but I'm just a regular person who needed help." "But Uncle Arthur was good at fixing things that were broken, and we were broken after Mama died. Now we're getting fixed." James reached over to smooth his daughter's hair, his own eyes bright with unshed emotion. "You might be right about that, little philosopher." The blizzard finally exhausted itself on the third day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. James ventured out to check on the mules and clear paths between the cabin and barn. "The snow's almost as tall as you are," Victoria observed. "I could make snow angels the size of real angels," Annabelle replied with excitement. When James returned, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice crystals from his coat, he said, "The animals are fine, and nothing's damaged that can't be repaired, but we're pretty well snowed in for the next few days at least." A week later, Christmas arrived with clear skies and bitter cold that made the snow squeak underfoot. James had planned to go into town and pick up supplies to have a nice Christmas dinner. "I should be back in a few hours," he told Victoria and Annabelle. "There's plenty of firewood outside if you need." Victoria and Annabelle watched as he hitched the mules to the buckboard and slowly made his way out of sight. As the day wore on, though, the skies began to cloud over, and the howling wind cut through the wooden walls of the small cabin like a knife through butter. Annabelle sat on Victoria's bed, her legs tucked under a patchwork quilt, reading a book, while Victoria busied herself making biscuits with the last of the flour they had stored on the shelf. Annabelle would read out loud, while Victoria helped her sound out words. But as the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified, Victoria began to worry that James may not be able to make his way back from town. Snow pelted against the window with increasing fury, and the wind had grown so loud that she had to strain to hear Annabelle's quiet voice. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the fire, and Victoria found herself adding wood to the flames more frequently. "I'm scared," Annabelle whispered, pulling the quilt up to her chin. What if Papa can't find his way home? What if he's lost in the snow? Victoria sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed her hair. Your Papa is the strongest, smartest man in all of Dawson City. He's weathered storms worse than this one. We just need to be patient and keep the home fires burning for when he returns. As if summoned by their conversation, the cabin door burst open with a crash that made both females jump. James stumbled inside, his tall frame covered in snow and ice. His hands, even protected by thick mittens, were red and stiff from the cold. "Lord Almighty, it's brutal out there," he said, his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air as Victoria rushed to help him close the door against the wind. "The storm came up so fast I barely made it back." Annabelle scrambled from the bed and ran to her father, throwing her small arms around his waist. "Papa, I was so worried. Miss Victoria made biscuits, and we kept the fire burning just like you taught us." James lifted his daughter and held her close, his expression softening as he looked over her head at Victoria. "Thank you for taking such good care of her. I know this isn't the life you signed up for when you came north." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Annabelle is a joy, and we're all just trying to survive this winter together." James had caught a rabbit on his way back from town, and together he and Victoria made a hearty rabbit stew and beans for a quiet Christmas dinner for 3. The next morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had grown stronger overnight, and snow was piling against the cabin door. James spent the morning reinforcing gaps in the barn to keep the mules comfortable. Victoria taught Annabelle simple arithmetic using dried beans. It was just after noon when disaster struck. Victoria had stepped outside to gather snow for melting, leaving Annabelle by the fire. When she returned moments later, stamping snow from her boots, the cabin was empty. "Annabelle?" Victoria called, her voice tight with the first stirrings of panic. "Annabelle, where are you?" She searched the small space frantically, checking under beds and behind the few pieces of furniture, but the child was nowhere to be found. The back door, which led to the small shed where they kept firewood and tools, stood slightly ajar. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what had happened. Annabelle must have gone looking for something in the shed and gotten turned around in the blinding snow. In weather like this, a person could become lost just steps from their own door. Without hesitation, Victoria grabbed James's spare coat, a thick woolen thing that hung nearly to her knees. She wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed, and stepped into the howling maelstrom. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet, and the snow was falling so thick and fast that she couldn't see her own hands when she held them in front of her face. "Annabelle!" she shouted, her voice immediately swallowed by the wind. "Annabelle, can you hear me?" She stumbled toward where she thought the shed should be, feeling her way along the cabin wall until she reached the corner. The shed was there, its door banging in the wind, but it was empty except for mining equipment and firewood. Panic began to claw at Victoria's chest as she realized the child could be anywhere in the white void surrounding her. She forced herself to think logically, to move in a systematic pattern so she wouldn't become lost herself. She called Annabelle's name until her throat was raw, stopping every few steps to listen for any sound that might indicate the child's location. After several long minutes, Victoria heard something that made her heart leap. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakably human. A child crying. Following the sound, Victoria pushed through snow that was already knee-deep, her legs burning with the effort. The crying grew louder, and finally she spotted a small dark shape huddled against a fallen log about 50 yards from the cabin. "Annabelle!" Victoria fought her way through the drifts, her lungs burning from the cold air. "Thank God I found you." The little girl was curled in a ball, her thin dress and coat no match for the brutal conditions. Her lips were blue and she was shaking violently. "Miss Victoria," she sobbed, "I got lost. I was trying to get more wood for the fire like Papa does, but I couldn't find my way back." Victoria gathered the child in her arms, wrapping her own coat around them both. "It's okay, Sweet Pea, I've got you now. We're going to get back to the cabin and get you warm." But as Victoria tried to retrace her steps, she realized with growing horror that the storm had erased all traces of her path. The world around them was a uniform white, with no landmarks visible and no way to determine which direction led home. They were lost. Victoria felt fear threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced it down. Annabelle needed her to be strong. She needed her to be the adult who could fix this situation. Drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, Victoria began moving in what she hoped was the right direction, carrying the increasingly listless child in her arms. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they struggled through the snow. Victoria's strength was fading fast, and Annabelle had stopped shivering, which she knew was a dangerous sign. The cold was seeping through their clothes, through their skin, into their very bones. "I can't carry you anymore, sweetheart," Victoria gasped, setting Annabelle down but keeping her arms around her. "We need to rest for just a moment." They huddled together against what appeared to be a large boulder, using it to shield them from the worst of the wind. Victoria could feel despair creeping in as she realized they might not make it back to the cabin alive. She thought of James, working in the barn, unaware that his daughter and the woman he'd taken in were slowly freezing to death in the wilderness. Just when Victoria was beginning to lose hope, she heard something that made her want to cry with relief, a voice, deep and strong, calling their names. "Victoria! Annabelle! Where are you?" "James!" Victoria shouted, with what little voice she had left. "We're here! We're here!" Through the swirling snow, a dark figure emerged, like a guardian angel. James fought his way toward them. His face was etched with worry and fear, but when he saw them, his expression transformed into one of overwhelming relief. "Thank God," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. "When I came back and found the cabin empty, I thought my heart would stop. Are you hurt? Are you injured?" "We're cold, Papa," Annabelle whispered, her voice barely audible. "So very cold." James gathered both of them in his strong arms, his warmth immediately penetrating their frozen bodies. "I've got you now, both of you. I'm going to get you home and safe." The journey back to the cabin passed in a blur of exhaustion and relief. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, the heat from the fire felt like a miracle. James immediately began stripping the wet clothes from his daughter, wrapping her in dry blankets and positioning her close to the fire. Victoria, her own clothes soaked through, changed behind the hanging curtain, while James worked to restore warmth to Annabelle's frozen limbs. "She's not responding the way she should," James said, his voice tight with worry. "Her breathing is too shallow and she's barely conscious." Victoria emerged from behind the curtain wearing her warmest dress and a sweater. She knelt beside Annabelle and felt the child's forehead, alarmed by how cold her skin still felt, despite being near the fire. She quickly grabbed a book from the shelf and opened to a folded page. "We need to warm her slowly," Victoria read. "Too much heat too fast could shock her system, and we need to get warm liquids into her if we can." Together, they worked through the night to save Annabelle's life. James heated stones by the fire and wrapped them in cloth to place around his daughter's body, while Victoria prepared weak broth and tried to get small sips between the child's blue lips. They took turns holding her, sharing their body heat, monitoring her breathing, and watching for signs of improvement. "You saved her life," James said quietly, as dawn began to filter through the window. "If you hadn't gone out in that storm to find her, if you hadn't kept her alive until I could reach you both, I would have lost her." Victoria met his gaze and saw something there that made her breath catch. Annabelle stirred in Victoria's arms, her breathing finally deepening into natural sleep. The crisis had passed, but Victoria realized that something fundamental had changed between them all during that long, frightening night. They were no longer three separate people sharing a cabin out of necessity. They had become a family, bound together by love, sacrifice, and the shared experience of nearly losing what mattered most. In the days that followed, as Annabelle slowly recovered her strength, Victoria and James found themselves drawn together in ways they hadn't expected. Their partnership in caring for the child revealed how naturally they worked together, how their strengths complemented each other's weaknesses, and how much they had come to depend on one another. The harsh Klondike winter had tested them all, but it had also forged something beautiful and strong between them. Victoria had come north to marry one brother and found her true home with another, while James had discovered that love could bloom again even in the frozen wilderness, as resilient and surprising as life itself. "Are you going to stay forever now, Miss Victoria?" she asked in a voice still hoarse from illness. Victoria smiled as she smoothed the child's hair, her heart full of certainty about their shared future. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm going to stay forever." And so, in the wild heart of Dawson City, amidst frozen rivers and golden dreams, they found something more precious than gold: love, strength, and the family they never knew they needed. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rugged trails and tender moments of the Klondike. If stories of untamed romance and frontier courage stir your soul, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the next tale from Gold Rush Romance. Until next time, keep your heart brave and your dreams burning bright.